Hi, welcome to Elizabeth Reads. We have a place called Perfect, and we have been enjoying reading this together. We are now on chapter 2, which is A Silent Protest. Let's read it together. Violet woke with a start as the car crunched to a stop over squashed gravel. It was dark. She pulled herself up from the warm leather seat and peered out the side window. The house was big, much bigger than their old one, and looked like something from a magazine. The lights were on inside. She gasped and ducked back down. Two dark figures, one tall, one small, stood shadowed in the light from the open doorway. Violet's father looked at her mother, then unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. "Ah, Mr. and Mr. Archer," her father said, approaching the men. "We didn't expect a welcoming committee." "Well, of course, Dr. Brown. We wanted to see you settled," the taller one said, extending his hand. "We've been preparing all day. The house is spick and span, and we've the kettle on the boil," the smaller man said, stepping in front of the larger one to grab her father's hand. "Leave your stuff in the car and come in for a brew. I'm sure you must all be exhausted." "Of course. How kind," her mother said, reaching the front door to greet both men. "We'd love a cuppa." The four entered the house, leaving Violet to fume in her seat, seemingly forgotten. "Violet, come in from the car, pet. It's chilly out there," her father called from across the driveway. He hadn't forgotten her after all. It still didn't mean he cared about her, though. He only cared about his job. When he was offered it, her mother had said, "It's a job amongst jobs." It was probably like winning an Oscar for opticians. Her dad's exact words had been, "I'd be stupid, utterly stupid to turn it down." Her dad was an ophthalmologist, which meant he was an eye surgeon and cut up eyes all day. Violet thought that was disgusting. So whenever anybody asked, she said he was an optician. His work meant so much to him. Other people's parents always seemed to talk about how much they hated their jobs, but not her dad. Violet was proud of him, but that didn't mean she was happy to pack up all her stuff and leave her friends just because of his new job. She thought he was selfish and had told him as much through her tears the night he'd announced they were moving. She pushed open the heavy car door and poked her head out to look left and right. The driveway was dark and surrounded by large trees. Huge, twisted branches played on the wind, sweeping shadows across the gravel. Violet shivered as the leaves began to whisper. She jumped back and slammed the door, locking herself safely inside the car. Her mom always said she had an overactive imagination. Violet wished she knew how to make it underactive as she looked out on the dark yard and imagined all the monsters that might lurk in the surrounding trees. She'd have to make a run for it. She took a deep breath on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3! She flung open the car door, jumped out, and ran for the house. Without looking left or right, she bounded up the steps and leapt over the threshold. Just as she slammed the front door, she thought she heard laughter echo through the trees. She slid down the wall onto the hall floor, trying to catch her breath. Surely it wasn't laughter? Then the car door banged, and she froze. Was there someone outside? Her heartbeat quickened. "Violet, is that you, pet?" her mother called from the room down the hallway. "Come in and say hello to our guests." Violet shook the dark thoughts from her mind, putting all sounds down to the wind. "There goes your imagination again," she scolded herself, getting up from the floor. She pulled off her shoes and threw them down by the door. The hall was covered in shiny cream tiles, perfect for socks. She took a run and slid the whole way into the room straight ahead, coming to a stop against the kitchen table. 4 pairs of eyes stared at her, 2 in embarrassment, 2 in shock. "Violet," her father snapped, "we have guests." Violet didn't respond. She'd decided the night before that she wasn't going to talk to her dad for as long as it took him to change his mind and move them all back home again. She hated not talking to him because she loved him more than £1 billion, but she didn't want the same things as her dad. Her mom didn't really either. Rose Brown was an accountant in a successful firm and had lots of friends in their old town, but she told Violet that sometimes you had to do what was right, even though it was hard and you might not want to do it, and that this move was right for their family. Violet had thought about not talking to her mom either, but as an only child, that would mean she'd have no one to talk to at all, at least until she'd made some friends. Quickly, her dad covered the silence, introducing her to the strange men who sat round the kitchen table. "Violet, this is Mr. George Archer." "Just George is fine," the tall man said, standing up to shake her hand. She tried not to laugh. George Archer was so tall he couldn't sound straight in the low-ceilinged room. His head bent to one side, almost touching his shoulder. Everything about him was long, from his snake-like arms and wormy fingers to his pencil-thin nose that almost divided his face in 2. His head was completely bald and creamy white like a fresh-laid egg. Clearly uncomfortable, he quickly sat back down. And I'm Edward. Pleased to meet you, Violet, the smaller of the archers said as he stood to shake her hand too. Again, she had to stop herself laughing. Violet wasn't even the tallest in her class, but she was the same height as Mr. Edward Archer. What he lacked in height, he made up for in width. He was square like a loaf of bread. His head was attached straight to his shoulders as if he had forgotten to grow a neck, and his eyes stuck out a little as though they were trying to escape from his face. The two brothers wore the same brown suits and shiny brown shoes. Edward Archer had a funny bowler hat, just like the one on her dad's favorite painting of a man with no face. Mr. George Archer had the same hat, but his rested on the table beside him. He probably wasn't wearing it because it would fall off every time he stood up indoors. Both of them had weird reddish eyes hidden behind rectangular gold-framed glasses. They looked a little scary until George took his specs off. "Oh, it's just the glasses. I thought there was something wrong with your eyes." Violet smiled at the taller twin. "Why are the lenses red?" George Archer pushed his glasses back onto his nose. "They're rose-tinted." He scowled. Well, Violet, dear," Edward Archer quickly interrupted his brother, "it's a funny story, really, one we hope your father will help us solve. You see, this little town of ours is perfect except for one curious fact. Every single inhabitant here wears glasses. After only a short time in perfect, Violet, you and your family will find that your eyesight starts to get dusty. And then the edges of your vision will blur. Eventually, you will all go completely blind. We've had numerous scientists come to investigate our situation. They say it's because we're so close to the sun." "Ma'am," Violet quivered, trying not to cry. "I don't want to go blind. I like being able to see. I knew we shouldn't have moved here." "Oh, no, I didn't mean to frighten you, Violet, dear," Edward Archer said kindly. "I assure you the effects are only temporary. They wear off as soon as you leave this town of ours. Although I'm quite sure you won't ever want to leave perfect. Nobody ever does." The stout man smiled. "In fact, we have found a clever way around our little problem. These glasses work a treat. You'll find everybody here is wearing them. They're quite in vogue, as they say." He adjusted his own pair a little, resettling them on his nose. "You'll have to visit our spectacle shop, dear, so we can fit you with a pair." George Archer smiled. Violet grabbed her mother's pinstripe skirt. "I don't want to wear glasses, ma'am. There's nothing wrong with my eyes." "That's why your father's here, dear." Edward smiled. "Hopefully soon nobody will need to wear them." The Archers were her dad's new bosses. Eugene was headhunted, her mom said proudly to friends one evening. Violet didn't think that sounded like a good thing and tried hard not to imagine her dad without a head. He'd won an award for his research and had been on the cover of I Spy magazine. Her mom said the whole world was talking about it, or at least the part of the world that loved eyes too. She said the Archers had read the article in I Spy and searched him out for the job. "It's only for a short time, Violet," her mother shushed, looking anxiously at her husband. "Your father will fix the problem." "Don't worry, Violet," her dad said, reaching to rub her head. She moved round her mother's back, away from his arms. "She's tired," he sighed, his cheeks a little red. "It's been a long day. I think it's probably time for bed." "Oh no, not yet," Edward Archer said quickly. "You must try our tea. It's a perfect tradition." "Oh yes," George Archer smiled, grabbing a teapot and cup from the worktop. "It's our custom, I assure you." A small package sat on the table. Edward opened it, scooped out 2 large spoons of tea leaves, and tipped them into the pot. The package was navy, with Archer's tea, printed in ornate gold letters under a brownish picture of the twins in their bowler hats and white aprons. "It's you," Violet said, looking at Edward. "Eagle-eyed, I see." The smaller twin smiled, pouring boiling water into the pot. "Yes, it's our tea. We own the factory that produces it. It's a big employer in the town, something we're very proud of." "I don't like tea," Violet said, looking at her mother. "You'll like this one," George Archer replied sharply. "This tea is a specialty here. It's harvested daily and delivered fresh to every doorstep in perfect each morning. It's made from the chameleon plant, which is unique to our town. It's very good for your health and has the most unusual properties. You'll see what I mean. Most people here drink at least a cup a day. It's a tea-mad town," Edward smiled. Violet didn't like tea, and she wasn't sure about the Archers. There was something odd about them. Eugene and Rose looked at each other as they sat down at the table. Violet sat between them. George Archer stared at her from his place opposite as his brother poured the tea. "Now, imagine the nicest taste you can think of, and then take a sip," Edward said, raising his mug. Violet did as she was told. She imagined her father's favorite drink, which was hers too, ice cream sundae. Big chunks of cold vanilla ice cream dunked in fizzy orange. She pictured clouds of froth bubbling over the rim of a glass and could almost taste the burst of flavor. Her mouth watered as she raised the mug of tea. A waft of vanilla tingled her nose. She took a sip, careful not to burn her lips. The tea fizzed as she tasted orange and vanilla heaven. This couldn't be tea. She opened her eyes to check no one had swapped the cups, but sure enough, a dull, milky brown liquid smiled back at her. She glanced either side at her mom and dad. Their eyes were still shut and silly smiles played on their lips. "I think I'll have another cup," her father said a little later. "We thought you might," the Archers replied in unison. The Browns finished one pot and then had another as Edward told them all about their new home. Edward was the chatty one, and Violet warmed to him a little more than George, who just seemed to snarl and stare. Though, truth be told, she wasn't sure she liked either of them very much at all. Violet heard her mother say the same thing to her dad as they waved goodbye to the Archers from the steps of their new home a little later. "They give me the creeps, Eugene," Rose whispered through a staged smile. That night, Violet climbed between her new sheets in her new room. The town sounded nice enough from what Edward had said, and the tea did weigh heavily in its favor. There were some strange things about the place, though. Edward had told them about a curfew. He said it was so everyone got a good night's sleep and perfect. Sufficient sleep makes for a happy and healthy town. She definitely didn't like the idea of a curfew or going blind. And anyway, how could she ever live in a place called perfect? She'd have to be neat and tidy. She'd definitely have to brush her hair and probably even clean her shoes. It just wouldn't work. Violet made up her mind she didn't and wouldn't like perfect. Then she turned over and slipped into a perfect night's sleep, oblivious to the troubles the morning would bring. That's chapter 2. I will see you next time. Make sure to subscribe, and then you'll know exactly when chapter 3 of A Place Called Perfect comes out. Bye-bye.